Excellencies, human rights defenders, and other civil society activists with us today. My name is Dave Elseroad. I'm the head of advocacy at the Human Rights House Foundation. And on behalf of HRHF and our partners at Amnesty International, FIDH, Human Rights Watch, the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, International Service for Human Rights, International Commission of Jurists, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I would like to welcome you to this side event focused on the deteriorating human rights situation in the Russian Federation and how we can all support Russian civil society within this context. A few housekeeping points before we begin. Again, we are providing simultaneous interpretation today, and you may choose your preferred language at the bottom of the screen. In addition, we are recording this event and we'll make the English language version available shortly afterwards. Following remarks from our panelists, we will have the opportunity for formal interventions from delegations, as well as a Q&A. If you would like to take the floor to make a formal intervention on behalf of your government, please send a message to the panelists through the chat box. We also welcome questions throughout the event, and we'll do our best to pose them to the panelists. It's my role to ensure that we end promptly at 3 p.m. Geneva time. We meet this afternoon in the midst of a rapidly deteriorating human rights situation in the Russian Federation. Over the last several years, the Russian authorities have engaged in a systematic campaign of repression of human rights and restrictions on civil society. This includes shutting down independent media, intimidating and harassing human rights defenders and activists, banning peaceful protest, and imposing impermissible restrictions on the operations of independent civil society organizations. In the last several months, the intimidation, harassment, and attacks against human rights defenders, activists, and civil society organizations have attained an unprecedented level. Indeed, these increasingly repressive policies, coupled with the attacks on opposing and dissenting voices, and the chilling effect that these have had across Russian society, deliberately created an environment in which any checks and balances on the Russian authorities' power and actions, both domestically and internationally, have been eliminated. This clearly provided an enabling environment for Russia's renewed and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, which has led, of course, to the enormous loss of life, millions of displaced persons, and a mounting global food crisis. Against this backdrop, Russian and international civil society have been demanding action by the international community. The key focus of today's event is to get a closer look at the situation on the ground in Russia directly from Russian activists and human rights defenders, and understand what the international community and the Human Rights Council must do in response. Joining me today are 5 Russian human rights defenders and activists. They're primed and ready to go, so let's immediately turn to them. To begin with, it's my pleasure to introduce Liliya Vezhevatova from the Feminist Anti-War Resistance. Liliya, your organization was founded just after Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. And in the manifesto that your organization has released, you call on Russian feminist groups and individual feminists to join the resistance and unite to oppose the war. You have nearly 90,000 followers on Telegram, I believe. And to date, you've organized protests in more than 90 cities across Russia. Yet, I've heard criticism from outside of Russia that Russians simply aren't protesting the war. So if you could you tell us a bit more about the scale and scope of the protests taking place within Russia to the war?
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to stress that as feminists, we view the war in Ukraine as an ultimate patriarchal violence. We have been combating it for many years and continue fighting it today. Any anti-war actions and words are prohibited in Russia and repressed. There are massive arrests, detentions, strip searches in houses and their family members. They exterminate human rights organizations, civil rights organizations, and independent media for anti-war calls and for standing the position against the war. Russians can be put to prison for 15 years. People are detained, tortured, and they are prosecuted for their anti-war position. To evaluate the scale of anti-war movement can be done if we look at the fines, detentions, and criminal cases on anti-war activity of citizens. According to the over the Info Human Rights Organization, starting from February 24th in Russia for anti-war expressions, protests, publications in the internet, and anti-war signage. At least 16,000 people were detained. In the meantime, we know about 173 criminal cases for participating in protests and anti-war statements. According to a new criminal article on discrimination of the Russian army, 1,649 fines were issued, and this is immeasurable. Daria Tashkinova and Angorova were detained for the action called Women in Black. The activists were detained because standing in mourning gowns with white flowers in the streets without saying anything. Second example, Alexandra Skachelenko replaced the price tags in shops for anti-war statements, and Victoria Victori, who was arrested for posting information in the internet on anti-war meetings. They can be imprisoned for up to 10 years. Police violence against anti-war activists and the people of oppositional views becomes more systematic and aggravated. The detained face physical and psychological torture and violence from police. They are accused of treason and they are threatened with sexual violence. Alexandra Kalushsky, after being detained and anti-war action, managed to record on her phone how she was beaten and how every punch was committed. In addition to her, many other girls suffered. And also, I would like to mention the Alexander Teprikov's case. He was detained when he went to the publishing house to pick up anti-war stickers. At police station, he was beaten, threatened by weapons, to name other activists. Despite the risk of being arrested, violence, and huge fines, daily in many cities of Russia, people agitate against war using all possible means. For example, only in the action called Mariupol 5000, organized by feminist anti-war movement, over 850 self-made memorials were installed in 65 cities of Russia in the memory of peaceful citizens of Ukraine who died. In the conditions of aggravating repression, Russians invent other means. For example, they leave books with the leaflets on anti-war information, then they publish homemade newspapers, and they publish articles from prohibited media and disseminate them through the post box. Dozens of open letters were published in the internet when people were protesting, and many of those people who signed such letters were fired and prosecuted and accused just for signing these anti-war letters. People are fired from institutions, from educational institutions, from their jobs, just for doing that. Through new anti-war initiatives are those that have faced pressure for their anti-war position, and over 100 cases were registered. One more form of anti-war protest is with the breakage of the Russian federal agencies and the propaganda media. More aggravated forms of protest get more popular. Anti-war sabotage, refusal to fight at war in Russian railroads. There are more actions to stop movement of Russian troops to Ukraine. The partisan guerrilla anti-war movement called Stop the Railway Cause is doing it, as they say, and there are other actions that are against the Russian military industries. So we know at least 20 cases like that. Anti-war activists doing such radical forms of resistance risk their lives. The very question why Russians are not protesting, this is incorrect, because we would have to justify ourselves for in front of the people who are in a different context, people who live in democracies and who have access to more political freedoms and privileges, can hardly imagine the conditions in which anti-war movement in Russia is. However, this does not mean that Russians do not protest. They do, and even on a larger scale that would anybody imagine in our conditions.
Dave? Liliya, that's a powerful summary, I think, of the protests that are taking place in Russia, despite the incredible barriers to doing so. Why is international support important for those seeking to protest the actions of the authorities in Russia?
In the environment which I've described earlier, an international support is important to support Russian activists and all the people who are against the war in Ukraine and against the policy of the Kremlin. Recently, we have found out that the Russian authorities are not willing to continue the decisions of the European Court on Human Rights, and the Russian activists are getting in a more hazardous situation, which is very risky. We should not let the Russians to be isolated from international assistance. Representatives of countries and international organizations should use their leverage and influence to help these citizens. Russia has low living standards, low salaries. People do not have savings, and this makes them even more vulnerable if administrative and criminal cases are against them, if they are detained or imprisoned, or if there are any politically motivated firings, jobs, and it's important for the people to get financial support, to pay fines, to evacuate their relatives to safer places, or to have an opportunity to protect their families by providing the necessary things if they lose the jobs. Those activists who are under criminal prosecution and who are in prison should have an opportunity to get visas promptly in order to relocate to safer countries. The majority of activists are not ready to go through the procedure of getting political asylum because they do not intend to immigrate. They need the simplified visas in order to have an opportunity to move out of the country and to get back later. The longer the war continues, the more Putin is in power, the more human rights will be violated in Russia. The war should be stopped. And there is an interruption in the sound. Without anti-war movement, we cannot do it. Therefore, the Western countries should weaponize Ukraine more in order for Ukraine to protect itself, and the Western countries should stop paying to Russia for the fossil fuels because this fuels the war. The international community shall not isolate human rights activists in Russia, and our activists should be tied with their foreign peers, and this is the way to prevent future wars and violence. Russian activists risk their lives daily to stop this horrible war. We shall not let them locked, being alone with the aggressor, Russian government and its repression machinery. Thank you.
Liliya, thank you. I'd like to now turn to Ivan Pavlov, a lawyer, human rights defender, and founder of Team29 and DeptOne. Ivan, you're a human rights lawyer who's defended Ivan Safonov, a journalist charged with treason in a politically motivated case. You've also represented Alexei Navalny and led the defense in the judicial proceedings, which resulted in his group being labeled extremist and ultimately banned. As a result, last November, the Russian government added you to its foreign agents list. You responded that such a designation is some kind of honor, given the many brilliant journalists and rights defenders on that same list. Liliya spoke just now about the scope and the scale of protests in Russia against those in power in Russia who are committing gross human rights violations. What would you add to this, and how are dissenting and opposition views organizing themselves now in the face of this incredible repression? And similar to what I asked Liliya, what can and should the international community do to support dissenting and opposition views in Russia? Ivan, the floor is yours.
Спасибо, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you all for joining this event. Thank you for paying attention to our country, to Russia. Distinguished friends, in order to add on top of what Liliya has said, I would like to get you back earlier, the, before February 24th this year. In fact, this aggravation of human rights violations did not start when the war outbroke, not in February this year, but earlier. Starting from late 2020, we could see some preparations for the war when they cleared the information field. The regime exterminated everyone who created any independent information content that was noticeable, demanded, and that was not the same as the pro-government content. Now, after February 24th, we realized that it was made in order to create information sterile conditions for starting hostilities. After small independent content making groups were stopped, after 3 large independent media were shut down, it was just a technicality to stop it all. Ecom of Moscow, Dost, and others were stopped by just pressing one button, and the regime was very severe in repressing all these people. Some of them were detained and imprisoned, pushed out of the country. Some of them were tempted to be killed. Those who were brave enough to get back into the country were imprisoned. Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, these are heroes, but they have made their choice to go to prison because without getting back to the country, it would be more difficult for themselves to position them in current Russia as a real Russian politicians. However, independent Russian civil society includes not politicians only. There are activists, lawyers, journalists, human rights activists, academicians, artists. And let's look at what has happened to them. Independent journalism is absolutely prohibited in Russia today. There's military censorship. There are laws saying to stop the activities of independent media. Activists are prosecuted. We can refer to the FBK people, the human rights activist organizations like Memorial and Committee Against Torture were stopped. Academic freedoms are stopped. Academicians are put in the list of foreign agents and they are prosecuted through courts. Lawyers are prosecuted for their activism. It's not only me. There are many other colleagues of mine, even in June this year, when lawyers were either detained or fined for their professional activities. And now let's look at the Russian political immigration. Political immigration 100 years ago and today are very different from one another in the efficiency of their influence on the domestic situation in Russia. The reason of this difference is the developed information technology today. Earlier, the person would be fully erased from the information content of the country after leaving the country. Today, thanks to the internet, the immigrants may follow the events in Russia and they have access to a broader range of the media rather than those who are in Russia. In Russia, they block not only the internet resources, but also VPNs and other tools to avoid those restrictions. So VPN is poorly working in Russia. Those activists who were forced to flee Russia have fully recovered in their operation and they continue working abroad. We have not requalified, we have not lost the job that we have been doing. We continue working for the Russians and for the audience for which we used to work before we left Russia. Speaking of the legislation, look, the laws change to the side of aggravation. There's a law about the single register of foreign agents, about military censorship, the law and legislation about treason. All these are the ways to block information resources in Russia. Therefore, what do we have? Inside Russia, we can see less and less opportunities to get objective information. However, such information is possessed by those immigrant groups, each of which has its own disseminated network of information sources in Russia. The difficulty is that these organizations are disseminated across the globe, but not in Russia. However, this is also a matter which can be addressed technically. We are in touch with one another thanks to the internet. Civil society inside Russia is almost destroyed or paralyzed, but there is a part of it which actively operates abroad. Operations of the civil society in Russia is very important because this is the only counterbalance to the actions of the authorities which violate human rights. Today, we do not see this counterbalance in Russia today. So these are unique conditions when the international community cannot get objective information about the things happening inside Russia, processes and events. And therefore, certainly it is important to appoint a position of a special rapporteur who would establish a liaison not only with those who are inside Russia, but also with the immigrant groups, organizations, and projects that left Russia and who operate from abroad. Thank you for your attention.
Ivan, thank you so much for those comments. Before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to remind the audience too that we are soliciting questions, which you can, I believe I said in the chat box, but you can put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dilya Gafurova, the head of the Sphere Foundation. Dilya, in the February of this year, your organization was notified of the government's intention to liquidate it. The Kremlin claimed that your group's activities run contrary to so-called traditional values. Any follower of Russia and the Russian human rights crisis knows about the horrific treatment of the LGBT community in the country, particularly in the North Caucasus. Legislation enacted in Russia over the last decade, most notably the 2013 quote-unquote gay propaganda law, have led to substantial increases of homophobic violence. Your organization works to promote and protect the rights of LGBT people in Russia, and during the 2017 anti-gay violence in Chechnya, led efforts to stop abuse and evacuate survivors. So my first question to you is, how is the Russian authorities' use of the concept of so-called traditional values undermining human rights in Russia? Dilya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone. It's my immense pleasure to be here. Actually, I think it's very important that there is such an event as this one, that, as Ivan rightly put it, there is an interest in what's happening within Russia at the moment. As for the traditional values, for a decade now, firstly, as a reaction to mass protests in 2011, the Russian government has been consistently building up the concept of traditional values, and gradually it has become inseparable from a number of federal and regional policies, from family policy to national security strategy, and became in a way a state ideology, in part instrumentalized to justify Russia's approach to human rights overall, which is rooted in cultural relativism. For instance, this concept largely affects not only LGBT+ rights, but women's rights in Russia as well. As a direct result of such concept of traditional values coming into life as policy, in 2013, a federal law on the prevention of the so-called LGBT propaganda among minors was passed. Over the years, this law was mostly used arbitrarily to curb LGBT+ activism and crack down on awareness-raising campaigns through fining activists and blocking websites with materials on LGBT+ accordingly. However, it has most acutely, I think, affected LGBT+ youth. In 2021, Sphere started an informational and advocacy campaign against this piece of legislation, and in the fall of 2021, quite logically, the Russian Ministry of Justice initiated an unscheduled inspection into our activity. Soon afterwards, a number of other LGBT+ initiatives and LGBT+ activists associated with Sphere started being recognized as foreign agents, one after another. In February of this year, the Ministry of Justice took Sphere to court, saying its activity of 11 years was unconstitutional. And this very April, our legal entity was ruled to be dissolved, though we do continue our activity now as a team without a legal entity. The court ruling most amusingly stated, The court finds it unreasonable to single out a mentioned social group, meaning LGBT, as disadvantaged due to the lack of evidence that this social group is discriminated against and thus needs additional social protection in comparison to other citizens. However, the government does restrict the right of the members of the social group to enter into marriage as it runs counter to the traditional values safeguarded by the society and the state through legal means. Therefore, the court considers Sphere's work of calling attention to social vulnerability of sexual minorities as unjustified and aimed to change legislation enshrining a specific concept of marriage and reflecting moral and ethical norms supported by the majority of the Russian population. This is a clear-cut definition of how the Russian government currently sees LGBT plus people, what it thinks overall of helping them. While such a ruling is a dangerous precedent for the LGBT plus movement overall, and it can now be used to shut down any other LGBT plus organizations, the most worrisome trend for LGBT rights in Russia today is, it's all falling back to the notion of traditional values. The government is propelling it most forcibly after the start of the war, putting traditional values in juxtaposition to the so-called Western values, to ideologically consolidate its special way and further demonize in public rhetoric those countries who criticize the actions of the Russian government. And most recently, this very month, a new bill against LGBT propaganda was turned into the parliament. It suggests any LGBT-related information be deemed as propaganda, and there's no focus on minors at this time. It affects the entire Russian population. And this would effectively halt any informational campaigns and visibility on the part of human rights forwarding LGBT plus rights, and further forcing LGBT plus people into invisibility. And I even dare say it would cement, legally enshrine harmful notion that being LGBT plus is a result of outer influence rather than a part of an individual's identity. But it's basically something that can be flown in and projected onto a person, that it's, well, inherently non-Russian. It would completely erase LGBT plus people as a social group, as citizens of a country that need and have a right to protection under the law.
Dilya, then within the context that you're describing, what specific things can the international community do or should do to support your work, support the LGBT community, support groups such as yours, which have been forced to organize themselves informally, all of whom are under attack in Russia?
Well, Dave, it's, I think, of extreme difficulty to envision exactly what kind of mechanisms could be used to help the human rights situation in Russia these days, because the Russian authorities seem to be willing to enact certain discriminatory policies practically out of spite to what's expected of them under norms of human rights and international treaties and obligations right now. What I mean to say is, my fear is that direct involvement on the part of the international community could unfortunately prove counterproductive, though if there's readiness for such involvement for talks in the matter, it's still invaluable and much appreciated. Yet from what we are seeing on our side, informal talks where there's no visible pressure on Russian authorities could be more effective. And again, on our side of things, there's no clarity at the moment on how exactly to continue our work in advocacy, with Russia taking such a stance on human rights as it is right now, and with it not being a part of such institutions as the Council of Europe, for instance, and thus leaving us out of the option of taking discrimination cases to the European Court of Human Rights. We want to continue informing the population inside the country, especially now with the limited access to information, and increasingly so, and to keep together with the rest of the human rights community. In that sense, I am convinced that it is currently especially paramount for the Russian human rights community and for civil society to build and maintain ties to the rest of the world, to be able to share and discuss what is happening with the human rights in Russia and try to figure out a common course of action. To be perfectly upfront right now, we need all the support that we can get, because with a situation where human rights activists are, feeling this immense pressure, where there are arrests, where there are searches, more and more of them have this need to leave the country out of fear for themselves and most often for their family. And there's a growing vacuum of the assistance that can be provided for LGBT plus living in certain parts of Russia as a result of that. And even those who are continuing to work in the country, they face fines for gay propaganda or for protesting and stuff like that. So we're trying to take on all that load, and sometimes it just gets too much. And it could be of immense value for the people that we help. For instance, that we're getting more and more requests for emergency assistance when an LGBT plus person and their family especially again, this concerns LGBT plus activists are fearful for their well-being. And, we used to have all these diplomatic channels where we could go to people. We had certain emissaries that we could go to. Now, that access is very, very limited, and we don't really know whom to address and what channels to go through. And I guess in the end, we really need to feel that we still have that connection to the rest of the world, and that there are people that we can address, to know that there is that link still, and the actions of our government cannot really break it. So, yeah.
Dilya, thank you, and thank you for your work, and thank you for taking the time to really paint that really troubling picture of the situation for the LGBT plus community and activists in Russia. I'm going to turn next to our next speaker, Tatiana Glushkova, a former lawyer with the now liquidated Human Rights Center Memorial. Tatiana, in many ways, the Russian government has led the way in developing and implementing legislation to clamp down on independent civil society. In fact, we see the authorities in Azerbaijan, in Belarus, and Hungary, and other countries in the region replicating many of the same policies, unfortunately. As I mentioned, you worked as a lawyer for Memorial, a leading Russian human rights organization, which was liquidated by the authorities this year. And last week, supporters of Memorial founded a new organization, the Human Rights Defense Center Memorial. And today you're speaking on their behalf. Just this month, Russia's most prominent anti-torture group, the Committee Against Torture, was shut down. And today, independent civil society, including NGOs and media outlets, face the risk of being listed as, quote, foreign agents, or even as, quote, undesirable. How many organizations to date have been labeled foreign agent or undesirable, and what is really the practical impact of such a move by the authorities?
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you for giving the opportunity to address this meeting. Today in Russia, there are 4 registries of foreign agents. The registry of non-commercial organizations of foreign agents, media of foreign agents, non-registered organizations of foreign agents, and individuals who are foreign agents. The registry of NGOs that are foreign agents, there are 72 organizations. However, from the moment when the law was adopted in 2012, over 200 organizations were in the list, and those of them that were excluded from the list, many of them were liquidated, the majority, but some of them refused from getting foreign finance. The registry of the media foreign agents, there are 167 organizations and people. People can also be called the media, and they can be called foreign agents. And in the 2 remaining registries, there are 8 individuals in each, and non-registered unions. In the meantime, the Russian Duma reviews the draft law that will even aggravate the situation with the foreign agents in Russia. First of all, according to this draft law, and this draft law has been already adopted in the first hearing, and there are no doubts that it will become a full-fledged law. There will be a single registry of foreign agents first. Second, to get into this registry will be not only for getting foreign financing like today, but for any contact with foreigners or international organizations. The second component that is required to be on the list is performing any activity, any public post in social media, any physical contact with a foreigner will be good enough to get into this list. In addition, there is the term of persons affiliated with foreign agents. The registry of these persons will include employees of all international organizations and foreign agents, and those who get the money from foreign agents for the so-called political activity. Political activity, it can be anything, like expression of any opinion about the actions of the authorities. So, in fact, for example, if you are a defense lawyer in court, you can be called a political activist, and this will be political action. And if you are paid for doing this, then this will be considered that you are doing political activity. At that, if you do not follow the laws about foreign agents, even today, there is a criminal liability, and the people get behind bars. This is the law on extermination of the civil society, of the NGOs that have been working for many decades for the sake of Russia and its citizens. Memorial is not the only example. The Agora human rights organization was liquidated because of that. So the law wants to divide the society into those who are our people and foreign people. And those so-called foreign people will be not living normal lives if you, every 3 months, will have to report to the Ministry of Justice of what you spent your money for, and every comment in the social media shall be marked with 24 words that I'm a foreign agent, or people will be forced to flee the country. So this is the law to get these people out of the country.
Tatiana, before you, Dilya spoke very passionately about the need for a bridge between Russian civil society and the international community. We know that, and as I mentioned in my introduction, Russian and international civil society have demanded a special rapporteur for Russia to be established under the Human Rights Council, by the Human Rights Council, to play such a role. From your perspective, how would the establishment of a special rapporteur aid human rights organizations and civil society more broadly in Russia?
Well, my colleagues said a lot about the situation with the civil society in Russia. If we wrap up this description, we can say that this situation with the human rights is the most difficult since the breakup of the Soviet Union. On the one hand, the civil society is under unprecedented pressure from the Russian authorities. On the other hand, the sanctions against Russia inevitably affect the human rights activists and defenders. Simultaneously, there's a very small opportunity to leverage international community to help Russia. Has been expelled from the Council of Europe, and all the decisions of the European court taken after March 15th will not be affected, and there are many decisions of the court that were adopted decades ago. These were about the systemic violations of human rights. They have not been fixed. So we have the situation when there are lots of problems in human rights fields that have been identified, which require monitoring, and new problems emerge. Naturally, Special Rapporteur on Russia will not change the situation in the country right now. But this mandate will be the most important mechanism to document these violations. And documenting violations is the first step to acknowledging these violations, to stop them in the future, and to avoid them in the future, and to avoid the third cycle of converting Russia into the USSR. Moreover, monitoring and keeping track of what is happening in Russia is important not to Russians only. This is the matter of the first importance for the whole world. We may not simply put a new iron curtain, lock Russians inside Russia, saying there are no problems. Actions of Russia affect the whole globe. A Russian may start a nuclear war, change the climate, or provoke hunger in the world. Therefore, human rights issue is the issue of global security, and the current situation shall be addressed by the entire international community. Special Rapporteur is an important and a possible implementable action. Moreover, the Special Rapporteur will not only keep track of human rights violations in Russia, but will also represent, as Dave said correctly, represent a bridge between the Russian civil society and the UN Human Rights Council and the entire international community. We need this bridge, especially today, because we can see that the decision makers who decide Russia not always understand the Russian realities and make errors, and they have wrong judgments. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you so much, and thank you also for your work, and congratulations on the new unofficial organization. Our last panelist this afternoon is Natalia Prilutskaya of Amnesty International. Natalia, OVD Info, a prominent independent media outlet, I checked today, reports that more than 15,000 people have been detained in anti-war actions since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. Before it was liquidated by the authorities, Memorial, of course, reported that the number of political prisoners in Russia at that time had been more than 400. Late last year, my organization, Human Rights House Foundation, reported that it has never been more dangerous to be a human rights defender in Russia. So we've talked a lot about organizations and what organizations and civil society organizations and NGOs are facing in terms of risks and threats to their work. What risks do human rights defenders and other activists personally in Russia face for doing the legitimate human rights work?
Thank you very much, Dave, for your question, and thank you everyone who took their time and attended this webinar. Well, indeed, my colleagues have already mentioned quite a few challenges that Russian human rights defenders are facing in their work. And when I'm talking about human rights defenders, I mean not only people who work in NGOs, but also human rights lawyers, independent journalists, and activists who daily, do everything to stop this machine that is crushing the civil society in Russia. So it should be noted that by now the Russian government has developed quite an elaborate toolbox of repressions, which includes legislation, first of all, and some of these items of legislation have been mentioned. It is, of course, the Foreign Agents Law, about which Tatiana has just spoken, the law on undesirable organizations. We have seen people prosecuted under this law, and currently there are 2 people. One of them has already received their criminal sentence, and the other one is standing trial on charges of association with undesirable organization. But besides that, there is also, of course, the most recently adopted measures to effectively the war censorship measures to censor anyone who dares to speak and express different position from the position that is suggested by the Russian government to be the only correct one. I mean, the law, the legislative provisions that forbid to discredit the Russian armed forces and their actions abroad, and the provisions that punish for sharing the so-called false information about the actions of the Russian armed forces abroad, as well as the provisions that sort of punish for call to sanctions, both criminal and administrative provisions in the last 2 cases. So, but apart from that, of course, and we have seen already a dozen of people who have been prosecuted criminally, and many more who have been prosecuted under administrative legislation. Apart from this, of course, there's the old tool of the counter-extremism and counter-terrorism legislation. We have seen how many of the Alexei Navalny supporters and his organizations indeed, suffered under this, but that's not all. There are many more, and of course there are other laws that can put pressure on the human rights defenders. But apart from that, Russian authorities are also using such tactics as, for instance, putting pressure or opening sort of fake criminal cases against the family members of human rights defenders, like we've seen with Abu Bakr and Gulbayev, for instance. There are also tried and tested tools of defamation, disinformation, intimidation, very often done through the third parties associated with the government, and of course physical attacks on them. Thank you.
So, Natalia, within that context, I know Amnesty International is one of the organizations that signed an open letter to the international community calling for the establishment of a special rapporteur. We heard just now from Tatiana as far as what potential role such a position could play in terms of supporting human rights organizations. From your perspective, is a special rapporteur for Russia something that would benefit Russian human rights defenders, and if so, how do you see that playing out?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Tatiana has already put it so succinctly. So I'm just, you know, I will probably, I'm sorry if I repeat again some of the points that she has raised. But, you know, if you look at that, at the situation now, and if you look at the role that Special Rapporteur on Russia could play, you can roughly sort of identify three large groups of roles that this mechanism could play. So first of all, I would talk about practical role, where, you know, the Special Rapporteur could be the person who is collecting, analyzing, information about human rights violations in Russia, but also this is the person who can spot and sort of in-depth investigate both the current trends, but also give an early warning about the developing trends in human rights violations, so the international community could react in time. Then, of course, you know, the regular reports to the Human Rights Council could serve a tool for keeping Russia and situation with human rights in Russia on the agenda. Then, of course, you know, the expertise of Special Rapporteur and the information that they would have collected would serve as the grounds for solid evidence-based recommendations that you know, the international community could propose to Russia for implementation to improve the human rights situation, as well as, you know, this could serve for sort of better implementation, better impact in future. Of course, you know, we're not naive. We know how difficult it is, but, you know, it would take time, but, you know, we need to start somewhere. Then also, again, Tatiana has already mentioned this about the role that Russia plays in the sort of destabilizing the broader situation in the world. Russia is a significant international player, and what happens in the country has a ripple down effect to everything that is happening in the world. And you, Dave, mentioned some of the you know, effects to that as well. So by establishing the position of the Special Rapporteur, the Human Rights Council could sort of show this, it could be a symbolic, in a good sort of sense of the word, gesture, a symbol of how much importance the international community in sort of invests, signifies to Russia and human rights in the country. And last but not least, it is of course the solidarity role, because again, so the Special Rapporteur could serve as a contact point for Russian civil society. Again, Ivan has spoken about that, Tatiana has spoken about that. And well, the position would also signal that international community does care about what is going on, because so far, you know, I think there was this impression that it's sort of, you know, yes, it is important, but there are more important issues than that. And finally, also a Special Rapporteur could act as a sort of very powerful independent voice who could speak in place of those who are now, you know, devoid of this voice because of the repressions. Thank you.
Natalia, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists, of course, both for your willingness to join us today, as well as just for the work that you're doing. Before I open the floor up for interventions from delegations, we do have one final short statement from Karinna Moskalenko, who many of you would know is a prominent human rights defender and member of the Moscow-Helsinki Group. So Karinna, you have the floor.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, thank you for this opportunity to express my view. Today's crisis had happened not in one moment. Many years we were witnesses of fast deterioration of the situation in Russia. Did we have at our disposal effective instruments to prevent this crisis? In my view, the outside world, Europe, were very reluctant about the situation in Russia. International institutions maybe are the highest, maybe the best creature of the civilization. as well as the universality of the international standards and guarantees, as well as the instruments for the human rights protection. But the problem with these international institutions, a lack of visibility of the civil society. And civil society is the best indicator of what's going wrong with the human rights protection in the given country. The situation with the lawyers in Russia, the advocatura, as we call this community, and with the human rights community, all those who are doing human rights cases and human rights protection in general, there was the first indication demonstrates degradation and complete crush of the democratic values in our country. Look at the situation with the lawyers in country, especially in our country for the last decade. And one can see problems and obstacles in the Russian Federation. Lawyers became more and more oppressed themselves, so they couldn't guarantee that themselves their safety and security, and that's why they couldn't guarantee the protection of ordinary people, their clients, their defendants. And lawyers signaled about lack of independency of the judiciary, imitation of due process. This signal, this symptom was very much visible, but unfortunately, the international community have not been paying enough attention to this problem. Now we cannot do too much inside Russia. What I call for, Russian opposition, Russian civil society, Russian human rights defenders should not be forgotten and lost alone. We have to find a way how to support them if they are continuing their activity. It's not easy now. Let us help them. Thank you very much for your attention.
And Karinna, thank you for that. It's now my pleasure to welcome interventions from delegations, and I believe we have a representative from the from the Lithuanian delegation. Ambassador, if you are with us, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dave, and thank you also to the Human Rights Health Foundation and other co-sponsoring NGOs for this side event, and it was very important for us to hear the voices. And also what I heard at the last message about the human rights defenders. For us, we think that Lithuania is standing for the human rights as such, and for a long time, but human rights defenders is a very vocal and important part of this whole area of our life, and supporting to human rights defenders and empowering your testimonies is a very important to us, because what I got from these interventions here, that one is the thing about the situation is very much influenced by legislation that is being passed, and the other element is by implementing this legislation. So legislation which has this very powerful discouraging effect to do any activities. And then we have judgments which should be probably legal, but in many cases they look more political. And then we see that the enabling freedoms are disappearing, and maybe these enabling freedoms are the first that were dealt with. For us, we support nationally for some time is freedom to, especially freedom to assembly and association, but also other enabling freedoms, because these are tools, the tools to help implement other rights. If these enabling freedoms disappear, then there is a danger to all others, and even those rights that sometimes are claimed to be protected. So this is, and here again, this relates to the human rights defenders. This is how the existence of enabling freedom on one side and activities of the human rights defenders on the other side. And thank you very much for this. So thank you for this information, and for maybe in this way, in this meeting here, also in some way implementing this some of these enabling freedoms. And we heard quite clearly the request on the increased scrutiny of the situation by the Human Rights Council. That was the special rapporteur was mentioned here. And I think this call it's not very this action is of course not very quick probably, but the more involvement from the Russian civil society we see, the closer I think this goal could happen. So thanks again for this testimonies. Thanks again for raising these issues and providing us with the information and keeping this topic on the agenda, because sometimes it so happens that more pressing issues come and then they take precedence, and the very systematic violations sometimes are less visible. So in this case, I just want to thank you again for participating here.
Ambassador, thank you, and thank you for your support, and thank you for joining us for this event. We also have a representative of the Polish mission with us today, wishing to take the floor. Lukasz Rozycki from the Polish mission. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. First of all, let me congratulate you on this very timely event, and thank you, panelists, for clear the picture from the ground. I would like to, taking this opportunity, express my admiration for courage and commitment of civil society representatives in Russia. We fully share concern about the situation of human rights and the fundamental freedoms in Russia, which continues to significantly deteriorate, and is even more evident in the aftermath of the beginning of the Russian aggression against the Ukraine. We deeply regret an unprecedented escalation of the repression against civil society, which we concurred, and we are concerned also about the rising number of political prisoners, and in that context, I would like to mention that the large of them constitutes to those who are repressed on religious grounds, such as Jehovah's Witness or Muslim groups, who are prosecuted with regard of alleged extremist or terrorism-related charges. And against this background, we think that support for civil society, independent media, individuals opposing the war, as well as promotional respects for human rights in Russia, should continue to be important task for the international community. And it's also important that the Human Rights Council closely follows developments in Russia. In this vein, during the previous session of Human Rights Council, Poland delivered on behalf of 51 countries representing 4 UN regional groups a joint statement on deteriorating human rights situation in Russia, and it was a follow-up of our activities concerning Russia. And we will not lose sight on this important matter for sure. And in this context, I would like to ask 2 questions to the panelists. First, what are the most important practical ways of support for the CSO and independent media and researchers in Russia you would expect in the current political and legal situation and circumstances? And the second one, how do you see the role of the UN mechanisms, again, the background of Russia's exclusion from the Council of Europe and its currently induced legislation of non-implementation of ECHR judgments issued after 15th of March 2022. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to for the interventions from the Polish and Lithuanian missions. Of course, we hope that your missions and all of the European Union missions consider taking a lead on a resolution establishing a special rapporteur at this council session or perhaps the next. So thank you again. I think at this point we will, seeing no other delegations wishing to take the floor, I'm going to open up to questions for our panel. And I think first I'm going to put Ivan, if he's with us, Ivan, I'm going to put you under the spotlight first. There's a question here in the box that, and I'm asking you as a human rights defender in exile. And the question is that diasporas historically have had a positive influence on democratic change within their country, or the country from which they are exiled. In your opinion, how effective are diaspora actions, Russian diaspora actions at this point? And how do you anticipate that their cooperation or actions will evolve in the coming period of time?
It seems to me that the potential of today's Russian diasporas is much larger if we compared them to earlier diasporas from Russia. As I mentioned earlier, the difference is that today we have the internet. Thanks God we have it. And we have it in Russia still. So information exchange back in 1920s did not exist. If you leave the country back then you would see an information wall, an information fence. You would not get information from Russia and you wouldn't be able to impact anything in Russia. So information exchange is the key to the disclosing of the potential of the diaspora. So I believe today's immigration is much stronger than before. Certainly, everything depends on whether we can leverage this potential, but let's be optimists. I can see my colleagues addressing you today. They had very bright speeches. They sincerely want to see changes in Russia. They're not striving these changes only, but they are facilitating them. We need help. Speaking of providing help in Russia, this should be done very carefully, because if any assistance is identified in Russia, then the person getting this assistance in Russia is getting under threat. We should address the groups who have their own networks and information chains, but who are headquartered in other countries. These expat groups should be seen as the points of potential that should be unleashed, and they require support. We, from our side, will support those who are in Russia. But this assistance is very delicate, is very confidential, is unsafe, and this is the responsibility and liability that we are sharing between ourselves. Thank you.
Ivan, thank you for that. I think I might turn to Natalia next. Natalia Prilutskaya from Amnesty. As you know, and as many people know, last week the Russian authorities expanded their assault on independent media. I think it was 29 British journalists were banned from the country. What does the banning of foreign journalists mean for the human rights situation in Russia generally and for Russian human rights defenders specifically?
Well, it's just closing another opportunity for the international community to know more about Russia, and it is also closing an opportunity for, the Russian civil society to signal what is going on and what is going wrong in the country. So we have seen unprecedented attack on media freedom since the start of the so-called special military operation. And this is not just a coincidence. That's completely, and also if we compare this with what happened, for instance, a year ago when Navalny returned to Russia, when there were those massive protests in his support, we can compare how the Roskomnadzor, the organization, the sort of the media watchdog, reacted at that stage, right? When there was also sort of banning of sort of spreading false information about the rallies in support of Navalny. There were threats that, for spreading this information, which the government considered to be false about, the number of participants, for instance, the media could be prosecuted. So it's very clear how this is just a mop-up operation, basically, to talk in military terms. But also, if I could add to what Ivan has said and what the Polish ambassador, the question that was asked earlier, how other countries, European countries, for instance, could help, how the international community could help, apart from the establishing, for instance, the position of the special rapporteur at the UN level. It's of course, it's also, looking at the situation, you need to transport yourself from the past into the now, really, because the current situation is that Russian human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, a lot of them had to emigrate to be able to continue work on Russia. Work on Russia is possible now outside of Russia. And so the role of the international community now is to support these people. And supporting could be done in very practical terms. People don't want to get into asylum procedures. Provide visas for them, long-term visas that would allow them to work in your country. Allow them to establish the office of a newspaper, sort of a media outlet, a human rights organization, so they could continue, facilitate that, promote, their connections with the local networks of journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders. All this, in the end, would actually drip into Russia and will have a positive effect on the situation in Russia. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Dilya, I'm actually going to put you on the spot next, and it involves what we saw come out of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe yesterday. Yesterday, it passed 2 resolutions and approved 2 reports, which specifically focused on the human rights crisis in the Russian Federation. One of the reports focused exclusively on the situation in the North Caucasus, which for any observer of Russia has remained a bastion of pretty substantial human rights violations for decades. The report highlighted kidnapping, torture, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, other ill treatment and persecutions of HRDs, which I think they specifically cited, including journalists, women, and LGBT plus persons. The report goes on to describe this general atmosphere of impunity and widespread fear across the region, which I think is something that we've seen again for many years in that region. But from your perspective, to what extent is that atmosphere of impunity and fear that was described in the North Caucasus something that is beginning to expand beyond just the North Caucasus, and a sense of impunity and fear that might exist in other regions across the country?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. I believe that question was to me. I have a bit of an unstable internet connection. My apologies. It needs to be understood that the North Caucasus is a very specific region. It is culturally extremely differently set other than the rest of Russia. However, of a situation that's been allowed to happen and has been happening for now so many years, the fact that there is this impunity as such due to cultural specificity of the region, I think it goes to say that there is this lawless regime around the situation, that if the situation is complicated enough, the federal authorities prefer not to get involved. With North Caucasus, because of the very fragile relationship that exists between the federal government and the head and the certain people in the region, the authorities in the region, the Russian government always preferred not to get involved. And that's why there were kidnappings and torture and abuse. And we have been, despite the fact that we have been partially successful in getting people out and in relocating them, we haven't always been. And we had to be very creative in the ways that we went about it, and extremely secretive, which I do not think is in any way indicative of an atmosphere of law, upholding the law and human rights regime that is helping people in any way. The Russian government has always kept this silent. It has never expressed its opinion on what's happening, because this is, it's not in any way only about traditional values and being LGBT. This is about human lives, which are at stake. And this tradition of honor killings especially seems so vulgar at this particular time in 21st century. And there has never been a comment on that either. I truly believe that the situation in the North Caucasus region will continue to deteriorate, because right now the Russian government seems to care even less about what it looks like from outside. If before we were able, again, go through certain channels and to put pressure on the Russian government and somehow get people out, we were able to go with this to the European Court of Human Rights and to try and create a situation where this person could be got out of such a certain situation. Well, now we can't. So definitely I see that this trend will continue. There's this trend for deterioration. As much as this could spread onto the rest of the country, well, there is that window of possibility here, but it's not going to be in the same way, of course, because again, there's so much cultural specificity to the region. I believe that because of a general approach to being LGBT+ on the part of the Russian government, however, now there will be increased social hostility against LGBT+ people, because if it is legitimized to discriminate against somebody who's LGBT+, if LGBT+ are being seen as non-Russian as a result of outer influence from abroad, well, then it's okay to hate on them, quite simply. And if that's the truth, then there will be more instances when LGBT+ people are abused, when they face violence and discrimination on an everyday basis as well. And they will not feel like they can go to authorities with that. And even if they do, probably they will be laughed at, or they will be persecuted because they're LGBT+ and because they speak out against the abuse that they face. So I definitely think that it will get worse, just not in the same way.
Thank you for that. We have another question that I would like to pose to Liliya Vezhevatova from the Feminist Anti-War Resistance. Liliya, to the extent that you're comfortable answering this as an activist in Russia, but the question is, and I presume that this is for people outside of Russia, what channels are the best to use or to raise awareness within the Russian population inside of the country, given the current situation? So we don't want you to necessarily reveal things that put anyone in jeopardy, but if there are suggestions or recommendations you have for people and organizations that are interested in speaking directly with the Russian population, what suggestions and recommendations do you have?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for your question. I believe that the international community should focus not on raising awareness of people inside Russia, because the military censorship that is effective in Russia today has cut the Russian population from any possible sources of information, from any opportunities to read anything that would not comply with the opinion of the authorities. The only opportunity to break this information blockade, the only opportunity to fight it is to use guerrilla methods of raising awareness of people on what is going on, to share information with them in a spotted way, targeting particular groups of population, fine-tuning the information for them, the information that would be relevant to them, that would facilitate the process of them doubting some government opinions, and for them to start thinking. And we also use guerrilla methods to move from the stage when we have single anti-war voices, when we have only individuals who feel alone fighting the whole society. If we have groups established, we show people that they are not alone. We show we are many, that we have an anti-war movement, which is on a larger scale. Therefore, the international community should focus on supporting activists inside Russia, not trying raising awareness of the population of Russia as a whole. When you're not in the context, when you're not in the country, when you do not understand the specifics and trying to influence large masses of the Russians, this is not we would like to see from our colleagues from the international anti-war movement and from the international community. You'd better focus on helping the activists. My colleagues and I have already described it. There are tangible things, meaningful things that complicate our work. There are obstacles that prevent us from what we could do. So you could focus on these obstacles. Thank you.
Liliya, thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to turn it over to Tatiana Glushkova of formerly the now liquidated Human Rights Center Memorial and the new unofficial organization, Human Rights Defense Center Memorial. Tatiana, final question for you then, and I think this built a little bit off of the final points that Liliya was making, but within this context of the situation now on the ground in Russia that is repressive, that is increasingly repressive and brutal for human rights defenders and activists, what role do you think the diplomatic community within Russia can play in terms of supporting human rights defenders and independent civil society?
Well, if we speak about the diplomatic community, then practically on a weekly basis, we can hear the news that more diplomats have been expelled, pushed out of the country. And now we understand the diplomatic community has less opportunities to support us as before. Still, all these forms of support that we've discussed for many years are still valid in those cases when diplomatic missions are invited to various events, please come. Certainly, we have much less of those events, but still they happen. Also, this is the issue about issuing visas for the activists and human rights defenders, because none of us knows when he or she will have to flee from the country. And also about you participating in the court trials, especially those trials that are against the activists and human rights defenders. All these forms of support are still important. But naturally, and this is critically important to understand, it's critically important to know that in every single case, please listen to those people that do that work. Today, or a year ago, I would say the diplomatic corps should pay attention to many events, and today, however, this can be hazardous because any contact with a foreign institution can be considered as an administrative or even a criminal violation in the nearest future. I'm sorry.
Tatiana, thank you for that. I'm afraid that's probably all the time that we have this afternoon. I'm keen to keep us on the schedule to end it at 3 p.m. Before we do close, I do want to remind delegations that the European Union delegation has drafted a strong joint statement condemning the human rights situation in Russia. And on behalf of my organization and our co-sponsors, we would encourage all delegations to consider signing on to that statement. Finally, I do want to thank all of the panelists, Dilya Gafurova, Ivan Pavlov, Liliya Vezhevatova, Tatiana Glushkova, Natalia Prilutskaya, all of whom face considerable risk for publicly criticizing the Russian authorities and their clampdown on human rights and human rights defenders. Your commitment to a safer, freer, more democratic, more fair Russia is inspirational. So thank you, and thank you for taking the time. In close, the Russian Federation's growing repressive policies combined with the country's departure from the Council of Europe and its diplomatic isolation from the states which have been supportive of human rights and civil society in Russia make it increasingly difficult for Russian human rights defenders, activists, and civil society organizations to engage with the international community, and unfortunately there's no end in sight. Without robust and genuine international support and a monitoring mechanism, independent Russian civil society organizations will continue to be left isolated and dangerously exposed. And so I want to reiterate our call and frankly demand on the international community, on Human Rights Council member states and others to take immediate action and establish a special rapporteur on Russia and to support human rights defenders and independent civil society. Thank you for your time, and thank you again to all of our panelists.